This is Matthew Kratter from Bitcoin University, and today I wanted to talk about what I think is going to be a future source of what I'm calling state-sponsored FUD, where the government goes out and says it was actually the Bitcoiners rather than the central bankers who caused the inflation. Before that, though, I just wanted to say how amazing it was to finally get to meet so many of you in person in LA at the Bitcoin conference at Pacific Bitcoin. The whole team at Swan did a really amazing job. If you're ever worried about Bitcoin's future, I would just recommend that you hang out with a bunch of real Bitcoiners in real life to realize how bright the orange future really is. I was lucky to meet so many of you, so many smart, generous, authentic, kind Bitcoiners in the last few days. You can hear my voice. I've been talking way too much, and yesterday I couldn't even make a video because my voice was so shot. So you'll have to bear with me today, but I have to say that Bitcoin's social layer is unstoppable. You should go to a Bitcoin conference if you haven't been to one already. And I'm planning to go to the big Bitcoin conference in Nashville at the end of July next summer. So I hope to see many of you there as well. It looks like Swan did a live stream of the stuff that was in the main tent, which you can find a link to in the description notes below. Various people, including one of my co-presenters, Phil Champagne's wife, posted this little clip of video. So a lot of you want to know what I look like. I'm obviously much older now than I am in my avatar. Hopefully Swan or someone else will get the full panel up at some point, and I will post it if someone sends me a copy. So I want to talk about Bitcoin FUD. This is one of the topics of the panel, so I want to share with you some of the things we discussed at that conference. As I said at the beginning of this video, the last and most dangerous kind of Bitcoin FUD, which of course stands for fear, uncertainty, and doubt, will be state-sponsored FUD. The classic example, of course, is when Rome burned. Nero blamed the Christians, who at that time were a tiny, weak, underground group of people with zero political power. But they had something similar to what I see at Bitcoin conferences. They have this tremendous conviction and loyalty to the cause and to each other. So by analogy, when fiat burns, you can be sure that Bitcoiners will be targeted by the dying fiat system. They'll say something like this: just look at these Bitcoiners. They attack the US dollar with their internet money, and they cause this tremendous inflation that's hurting all of us while they keep getting richer and richer. Now, obviously, as I've said many, many times on this channel, Bitcoin is not the iceberg. Bitcoin is a lifeboat. And so you should not be blaming Bitcoin. You don't blame the lifeboats. You blame the captain. You blame the crew. In other words, you blame the Federal Reserve. You blame the irresponsible fiscal spending of the federal government and the state governments. You blame the captain, the crew, and the iceberg for the sinking of the Titanic, not Bitcoin, which is how people are trying to save themselves. But that doesn't mean that people at the helm of a dying state won't try to pull something like this and say that Bitcoiners caused the inflation. Obviously, did we? There are two ways to talk about this. You can talk about inflation. In other words, everything is getting more expensive in terms of a currency. Or you can talk about the inverse, which is really the same thing, the loss of the purchasing power or the devaluation of the currency. And that's what we're seeing here since the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913, where $1 had purchasing power of what's essentially $26 in 2020. This is all indexed to 2020. So it's gotten even worse. But if you look at this, you can see over time, the US dollar is buying less goods and services. Its purchasing power is going down. Here's the invention of Bitcoin right here at the end at $1.20. And so you can't really blame Bitcoin for this complete collapse of the purchasing power of the US dollar, which has continued to collapse after Bitcoin and will continue to collapse. But this is clearly something that was happening 100 years before the invention of Bitcoin. And it is, of course, the Fed's fault. It's the money printing. It is the creating too much of a money supply. But what will always happen is governments will try to blame. They'll try to blame anyone but themselves or the central bankers. We talked about a few weeks ago, Trudeau blaming the heads of large grocery stores in Canada for high food prices. He obviously doesn't understand that these grocery stores have certain input costs and they make very, very slim margins. But again, it's anyone's fault except for the prime minister's or president's fault, and they'll always try to deflect blame. I made a video about this, which I'll link to in the description notes below, which I called Justin Trudeau's Groceries. This was a very, very sad video that was put out by the IMF, here retweeted by Peter St. Ange, talking about how inflation is caused by all these things, but they never once mention the money supply. So this is not serious economics. This is propaganda from the IMF, which is who you would expect to get propaganda from. It's important to remember central bankers are the most powerful criminal cartel that the world has ever seen. Before we talk more about that, though, if you're enjoying this video so far, if you want to help to support the channel, the best way is to subscribe if you're not already subscribed, like the video, comment, share it with a friend as well. So how does the central bank cartel maintain its power? They do it through propaganda and misinformation. And so you have fake economics, you have Keynesianism, which seeks to provide the justification for massive government interference in the economy, both at the fiscal level and at the monetary level. So, of course, they love having this theory, which basically says, oh no, times are going bad. Well, we get to spend a whole bunch of money and do deficit spending. Most Keynesian economists, when you look into it, actually just work for central banks like the Fed, or they live out their pathetic, parasitical little lives in comfortable university departments or think tanks. And Paul Krugman's really the preeminent example of someone who's led the most fiat existence and has just bounced from one university department to another, managing to pick up a Nobel Memorial Prize in economics as part of it. Of course, this was not an original Nobel Prize either, because this is not real economics. And the thing about Krugman, it doesn't matter that he's wrong. He's there as a propaganda megaphone for the regime, and so he'll continue to be wrong about Bitcoin, just as he has been wrong for the past 10 years. Am I being too dramatic or melodramatic predicting that Bitcoiners will be blamed for inflation? I don't think so, because we have many historical examples. This happened during the Great Weimar hyperinflation of the early 1920s. Even before that, the German government was, during World War I, was trying to get people to exchange their gold so that Germany could use it to fund the war efforts. And they were using slogans like, I gave gold for iron, and I guess you get a little sticker you could put on your shirt or something like that. For example, saying like, I got the, well, I'm not going to say what it was, but you know what a lot of people put in their arms in 2020. Executive Order 6102, another example where the U.S. government and FDR said, basically, you cannot hold gold as a private citizen anymore in the U.S., and they called it hoarding. They didn't call it saving. This is part of the propaganda. And this is how all the gold ended up in Fort Knox, or at least was taken from the American people. You were no longer able to own gold as an American citizen. You had to turn it in, and they paid you $20 an ounce for it. And then immediately afterwards, they revalued it to something like $35 an ounce. And in the process, they were blaming gold holders for the inflation, just like they're going to do with Bitcoin. If you want to learn more about this terrible incident in American history, which violated every part of the Constitution, and the Supreme Court was too weak to go against it, you can check out this article called The Great Gold Robbery, which is quite interesting. But as part of it, we can see that Roosevelt labeled anyone who did not surrender their gold as a hoarder. And of course, this is just a misuse of language. What is a hoarder? Someone who refuses to be robbed by their government, which wants them to exchange something of value for something of less value. I gave gold for iron. I gave gold for US dollars. So a hoarder is a saver. It's someone who produces more than they consume, someone who's thrifty, low time preference, planning for the future, privileging future goals over present pleasures and consumption, thus creating a capital surplus. And this is a real key to civilization and forward progress. This is a capital surplus coming from savings that can be invested in humanity's future and in its technology. But instead, governments will try to blur the language. If you're saving in U.S. treasuries, you're a prudent saver and you're following your financial advisors' advice. They're good advice, quote unquote good advice. But if you're saving in Bitcoin, you're a hoarder and an enemy of the state. We will see this in American history coming up. The only way to avoid it, though, is if we can get enough people, enough Bitcoiners, both inside and outside of the government. If we have 10, 20, 50 million Bitcoiners in the US and in other countries, it'll be much more difficult for states, for the US government and other governments to weaponize this kind of language against people. Because if everyone's a Bitcoiner, you can't really call the whole population hoarders. This is Cory Klippsten's concept of the race to avoid the war. If we don't want to have an all-out war of the U.S. government against Bitcoiners, we need to get as many Bitcoiners, create as many new Bitcoiners as possible in the coming years. And Cory estimates that in the U.S. it's something like 10 million Bitcoiners. And once we reach this number, we are the intransigent minority and on our way to being the intransigent majority. And then at this point, the U.S. government will no longer be able to weaponize this against citizens, because there'll just be so many Bitcoiners, both inside the government and outside the government. Also link to that video I made last week about how Bitcoin FUD goes away forever. It goes away forever when the whole world needs it as a lifeboat, and no one is criticizing or FUDding the lifeboat that they're swimming towards in cold water. But there is this intermediate stage that could be very nasty if we don't create enough new Bitcoiners between now and then. In the end, all FUD will disappear. But between now and then, we could have persecution, sort of a Nero-like persecution, if we don't create enough Bitcoiners. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow on Monday with a new video. Thanks a lot for watching.